Every woman in that room wanted him to look at her. She was the only one who didn't. And that, more than the silk, more than the rehearsed curtsies, more than the careful laughter, was what undid a duke who had never once been surprised by a woman. Until her. This is their story. London in the spring of 1814 was a machine, and the machine had one purpose that season: to produce a duchess. Every drawing-room from Mayfair to Marylebone hummed with it. Every modiste on Bond Street had been booked since February. Bolts of silk in ivory and pale gold disappeared from shelves like wartime provisions, because, in a sense, that is exactly what they were: ammunition. The target was singular, specific, and by all accounts almost impossibly difficult to reach. Marcus Calloway, the 7th Duke of Calloway, was returning to society. 2 years he'd been gone, 2 years behind the walls of Greymere Park, 140 rooms of grey stone and silence set in the Hertfordshire countryside, 3 miles east of the village of Ashwick, surrounded by 600 acres of oak and elm, and a garden that had been slowly dying since his mother stopped caring whether it lived. His father had collapsed in the East Corridor during a Tuesday dinner and was dead before the surgeon's carriage cleared the gatehouse. Marcus had inherited everything that same night: the title, the estate, the debts his father had organized into such meticulous columns they almost looked intentional, and a loneliness so complete he had simply built his days around it the way a river builds around a stone. He did not come to London. He did not attend. He did not reply. And London, naturally, found this irresistible. The mothers were the worst. God bless them, every last scheming, sharp-eyed, utterly relentless one of them. They mapped the season like generals planning a campaign. Lady Pemberton had her eldest daughter practicing her curtsy in the music room until the girl's knees ached. Mrs. Dalrymple had commissioned 3 gowns for her youngest, one for each ball where the Duke had been confirmed, at a cost of £14 apiece, which was £2 more than the family spent on coal for the entire winter. The Honourable Miss Graves had been coached to mention Hertfordshire casually in conversation, as though she simply adored the county and thought about it often, which she did not. She thought about hats. Every one of them wanted to be seen. Every one of them had rehearsed the precise angle of a glance, the timing of a laugh, the careful architecture of appearing effortless while calculating every breath. Now, 3 miles from Greymere Park, in a rented cottage with a damp kitchen wall and a gate that stuck in wet weather, Eleanor Ashford sat at the kitchen table with a volume of Cooper's poetry and absolutely no intention of going anywhere. Her fingers, ink-smudged at the tips, always ink-smudged at the tips, held the page open at a passage she had read 4 times already. The small leather-bound book was soft at the edges from years of handling, its spine cracked in 3 places, and she carried it the way other women carried fans. It went where she went. It was hers in a way very few things were. Her mother stood at the doorway. Catherine Ashford was a woman who had buried a husband, managed a household on a solicitor's modest pension, and maintained a friendship with Lady Hadley for 31 years through sheer, unrelenting correspondence. She wore a faded cornflower blue dress with a plain white collar and the thin brass wedding band she had never removed, worn so smooth now it caught no light at all. Her grey-green eyes, the same shade as her daughter's, though sharper at the edges, fixed on Eleanor with the particular expression of a woman who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to agree. "You are going," Catherine said. 5,000 words of argument compressed into 2. Eleanor did not look up from Cooper. She went. The Hadley ballroom was a cathedral of vanity. 200 candles in 3 chandeliers turned the air thick and golden and faintly suffocating. The heat pressed against the skin like a hand. 46 women in pale gowns stood arranged around the room's edges like flowers in a hothouse, each one angled slightly toward the door, each one pretending she was not angled toward the door. The string quartet played something bright and relentless that nobody listened to. The noise, conversation, laughter, the rustle of silk, the clink of crystal, rose to the painted ceiling and stayed there, a living thing with no room to breathe. Eleanor wore sage-green muslin with a cream fichu at the neckline and a thin forest green ribbon sash beneath the bust. The dress was 3 years old. She did not care. She found a gilt chair at the room's farthest edge, near a window that had been painted shut sometime during the last century, sat down and opened her book. Around her, the room waited. He arrived at 10 minutes past 9. The doors did not announce him. No footman called his name. He simply appeared. 6'2", dark navy tailcoat, white cravat starched to architectural precision, a pale grey waistcoat with vertical stitching so fine it was almost invisible, and the room reorganized itself around him like iron filings around a magnet. Every conversation shifted pitch. Every fan moved faster. Marcus Calloway walked the way he always walked, deliberate, unhurried. One hand clasped behind his back, the other at his side, the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand catching candlelight as he moved through the required greetings. His face, strong jaw, straight nose, those deep blue eyes set beneath dark brows that made his resting expression read as stern even when he was merely thinking, gave nothing. He bowed to Lady Hadley. He acknowledged Lord Pemberton. He endured the introduction of Miss Graves, who mentioned Hertfordshire within 11 seconds. He did everything correctly. He did everything as expected. His composure was immaculate, and behind it, he was counting the minutes until he could leave. And then his gaze drifted, past the silk, past the rehearsed smiles and the strategic fans and the mothers watching from their chairs like hawks on a fence post, past all of it to the far edge of the room, where a woman in a sage-green dress sat alone on a gilt chair with a book open in her lap, reading. Not glancing, not pretending to read while watching the room over the pages, reading, actually reading. Her honey-blonde hair gathered in a loose knot at the nape, a few wisps escaping along her temples. The small leather-bound volume held gently in both hands, as though it were the only real thing in the room. His mouth was still forming a reply to someone. He had no idea what he had just said. He had no idea what she was reading. He only knew it was more interesting than anything anyone had said to him in 2 years. The fire in the library at Greymere Park had been burning since October. Not this particular fire. Fires, plural, an unbroken chain of them, fed by servants who understood that the Duke of Calloway preferred his library the way most men prefer a furnace. Too hot. Always too hot. The kind of heat that makes the leather on the chair arms soft and the air thick enough to taste. Marcus stood at the window with one hand clasped behind his back, the other turning that heavy gold signet ring, thumb against crest, crest against thumb, and he was not thinking about the girl at the edge of the ballroom. He was absolutely not thinking about her. The honey-blonde hair gathered loosely at the nape, the small leather-bound book held open in her lap like a shield. The way she had not once, looked up to see if anyone important was watching her. He turned the ring harder. Greymere Park had 47 rooms. He had counted them as a boy, mapped them in a leather journal his father gave him, and now he occupied perhaps 6 of them with any regularity. The rest waited. Drawing rooms with dust covers on the sofas, a music room where no one played, bedchambers aired weekly for guests who never came. The estate generated £1,100 a year and cost nearly that to maintain, and the silence inside it had become so familiar that Marcus sometimes forgot it was silence at all. He mistook it for the sound of his own life. Breakfast that morning was served in the small dining room, the one with the east-facing windows that let in too much light before 9 o'clock. Philippa Calloway sat at her usual end of the table, silver-grey hair swept into that precise chignon pinned with the tortoiseshell comb, her posture so upright the chair seemed to owe her an apology for existing. She held her teacup the way a general holds a map, with authority and faint disapproval of the terrain. She did not mention the ball. Marcus did not mention the girl. The silence between them stretched across the white tablecloth like a third guest, pulling out a chair, settling in, helping itself to toast. Philippa raised the tortoiseshell lorgnette from the gold chain at her neck, not to look at anything in particular, but to let her son know she could look at anything she chose. She lowered it. She sipped her tea. She said nothing. 2 years she had been waiting. 2 years since the old Duke's death, since Marcus had taken the title and wrapped it around himself like a coat 3 sizes too large and simply refused to acknowledge that it didn't fit. He had become formal, controlled, private, a man made entirely of posture and appointments. Philippa had watched her son disappear into the architecture of duty, and she had waited, pale blue eyes sharp behind that lorgnette, for something, anything, to crack the surface. This morning he had come down 7 minutes earlier than usual. Philippa noticed. Philippa always noticed. The thin beauty mark on her left cheekbone seemed to rise with her almost imperceptible smile. She set down her teacup with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, and returned to her needlework without a word. Some women speak volumes. Philippa Calloway published entire libraries in silence. Meanwhile, the social machinery of the county ground forward with the reliable cruelty of a well-oiled clock. Lady Hadley, who had orchestrated the previous evening's ball with the precision of a military campaign, extended morning invitations to Catherine and Eleanor Ashford the very next day. A note arrived at their modest rented cottage on Briar Lane before the breakfast dishes were cleared. Catherine's grey-green eyes, the same shade as her daughter's, though more guarded, read it twice, then smoothed the paper flat with the same hands that smoothed napkins, adjusted collars, and held together a household on a widow's income. The thin brass wedding band on her left hand caught the light. She told Eleanor they were going. Eleanor did not want to go. She went anyway, because Catherine Ashford had a way of making refusal feel like cruelty to the furniture. They called at 3 houses that morning. At each one, Eleanor sat where she was placed, answered the questions she was asked, and committed the unforgivable social crime of being direct. When Lady Prescott called her garden lovely, Eleanor named the specific roses, the maiden's blush along the south wall, the damask near the fountain that needed deadheading, the single, struggling alba that would do better with more morning shade. Lady Prescott blinked. Catherine's hands tightened in her lap. Eleanor did not notice either reaction, because she was looking at the roses. She carried the small, leather-bound book of poetry, edges softened with years of use, tucked under her arm the entire morning. She did not open it. She did not need to. It was simply part of her. The way her honey-blonde hair always had those escaped wisps framing her face. The way the tiny, pale brown crescent birthmark sat just below her right ear, like a secret the rest of her face was keeping. That afternoon, Marcus Calloway called at Lady Hadley's estate, a social obligation. 12 miles on horseback. He told himself it was duty. He told his horse nothing, because the horse already knew. Lady Hadley's morning room faced south. The light came in wide and generous through 3 tall windows, falling across the carpet in pale gold rectangles. Eleanor sat in the best of those rectangles, reading aloud to Lady Hadley's aging companion, Mrs. Finch, who was half-deaf and fully delighted by anyone willing to shout Cooper at her with feeling. Marcus heard the voice from the corridor. He stopped walking. His hand found the signet ring, thumb against crest. She was reading The Task, the passage about winter evenings, domestic quiet, the fire, the drawn curtain. Her voice was clear and unhurried. She read the way she moved through rooms, as though trying not to disturb anything and disturbing everything. He stood outside the door for the length of 2 full stanzas. Then he stepped into the doorway, broad-shouldered frame filling it, dark chestnut hair catching the corridor light behind him, casting a shadow that fell directly across Eleanor's page. She finished the passage, closed the book, looked up. Those grey-green eyes, wide-set and entirely unimpressed. She did not curtsy. "You're blocking the good light." 5 words. No title, no deference, no performance. Just a woman telling a man he was in her way. Lady Hadley's teacup paused halfway to her mouth. Mrs. Finch cupped her ear and asked what was said. The south light pooled around Eleanor's feet like it had chosen a side. No one had spoken to him like that since his father died. The days that followed Marcus's visit to Lady Hadley's rippled outward the way a stone dropped into still water does, quietly at first, then in widening circles that touched every parlour, every kitchen, every after-dinner conversation within 10 miles of Greymere. The Duke of Calloway had been seen calling at houses he had not visited in 2 years. Let that land for a second. 2 years. This man had sealed himself inside that estate like it was a mausoleum, declined every invitation, sent polite refusals written in a secretary's hand. The neighbours had stopped expecting him. Some of the younger families had never met him at all. They knew the name, the title, the shape of the house on the hill, but the man himself had become a kind of elegant rumour. And now, suddenly, without explanation, he was appearing. At Squire Hadley's Thursday dinner, at the Vicary Estate's small garden party, at a luncheon hosted by the Collinses, who had only 12 chairs and had to borrow a 13th from the rectory. Speculation moved through those houses with the efficiency of a well-trained staff. Was the Duke considering a political appointment? Had there been a financial difficulty requiring social alliances? Was his mother unwell, more unwell than usual, and pushing him to secure an heir before it was too late? Nobody connected his movements to Eleanor Ashford. Why would they? She was the daughter of a widowed woman renting a modest cottage on the edge of the parish. She wore muted sage-green muslin and carried a book of poetry with softened edges. She had no fortune, no connections, no particular beauty that announced itself from across a room. She was, and this is the part that mattered, the part the parlours missed entirely, too unremarkable to suspect. But here's the thing about Marcus Calloway. That man was not attending these gatherings because he'd suddenly discovered a love of mediocre roast lamb and warm claret. He was attending them because Eleanor attended them. At the Hadley dinner, he sat 4 seats away from her and spoke exclusively to the vicar's wife about drainage improvements on the eastern fields. Eleanor sat near the foot of the table with her mother, Catherine, whose worn cream wool shawl kept slipping from one shoulder. Eleanor listened politely to old Mr. Hadley's account of his gout. She did not once look toward the head of the table. Marcus looked toward her end 7 times. The vicar's wife noticed. She told her husband. Her husband told the sexton. The sexton told no one who mattered, which is why it went no further. At the Vicary garden party, Eleanor stood near the herbaceous border, examining a stand of foxgloves, while her mother discussed the price of candles with Mrs. Vicary. Marcus positioned himself 12 feet away in conversation with young Mr. Vicary about the condition of the county road. His body faced Vicary. His attention faced the foxgloves. Eleanor crouched to inspect the base of a plant the way a physician examines a patient. Focused, unhurried, her grey-green eyes narrowed with concentration, one wisp of honey-blonde hair escaping from the loose knot at her nape. She did not notice the Duke. She did not seek him out. She was simply there, being herself, and he was the one who drifted. Every time, he drifted. Then came the afternoon at Greymere that changed everything, or rather, that made visible what had already begun changing. Philippa Calloway, the Dowager Duchess, invited Catherine and Eleanor for tea. This was not unusual in itself. Philippa had developed a genuine fondness for Catherine's practical company, and Eleanor's reading voice was, in Philippa's precise words, the only thing in this house worth listening to besides the fire. The invitation was delivered by a footman on cream paper sealed with the Calloway crest. Catherine smoothed her faded cornflower blue skirts and accepted. Tea was served in the south drawing-room, where the afternoon light came in long and golden through windows that needed washing. Philippa sat upright in her chair, perfectly upright, as though the furniture had been warned, her silver-grey hair pinned with the tortoise-shell comb, the lorgnette resting against her deep plum silk. Catherine sat across from her, her brass wedding band catching the light as she turned her teacup. They talked about the cost of coal, about the difficulty of finding a competent laundress in the country, about the particular stubbornness of damp in old stone houses. It was the conversation of two women who understood, in different registers, what it meant to manage a household alone. Eleanor excused herself after the second cup. She stepped through the glass doors into the garden and stopped. The rose beds at Greymere had been, in their time, extraordinary. 3 long beds running parallel to the south terrace, bordered by low box hedging, planted with varieties that the previous Duchess had selected herself. Gallicas, albas, damask roses, the old ones, the ones that smelled like the idea of a rose before anyone had tried to improve upon it. But the previous Duchess had been dead for 11 years, and the roses showed it. Eleanor crouched beside a damask rose that was barely surviving, leggy, choked with dead wood, its few remaining blooms blown and brown at the edges. She pulled off her gloves and laid them on the path. Her bare fingers moved through the canes with the certainty of someone who had done this 100 times. The small, leather-bound book of poetry, edges soft with use, sat on the gravel beside her knee. That's where Marcus found her. Kneeling in the dirt of his mother's garden, her hands in the soil, her cream fichu slightly askew, the tiny pale brown crescent birthmark on her neck visible where her hair had fallen forward. "These haven't been properly dead-headed in at least 2 seasons," she said, without looking up, as though he were a gardener, as though he were anyone. Marcus did not know what dead-heading meant. He turned the gold signet ring on his right hand with his thumb, that unconscious habit, that tell, and did not say so. Instead, he asked her to explain, and she did, without condescension, without looking at him. Still examining the rose, still touching the canes, she talked about removing spent blooms to redirect the plant's energy, about the difference between cutting above a 5-leaflet set versus a 3-leaflet set, about how neglected roses don't die so much as forget what they're supposed to do. Her voice was steady and unhurried, practical, the voice of someone sharing knowledge that mattered to her, with no thought for who was listening. Marcus stood with one hand behind his back, 3 feet from where she knelt, and listened the way he had listened from the doorway of the morning room, completely, silently, and with an expression that would have told anyone watching exactly what was happening to him. If you've been waiting for the moment everything shifts, this was it. Not a declaration, not a glance across a ballroom. A woman on her knees in the dirt, talking about roses, and a man who could not make himself walk away. Upstairs, Philippa stood at the window of the south bedroom. She had excused herself from Catherine on the pretext of fetching a different shawl. She had not fetched a shawl. She stood with her lorgnette raised, watching her son stand motionless in the garden beside a woman who was explaining deadheading to a duke. She lowered the lorgnette. The thin gold chain settled against the black lace at her collar. "Well," she said, to no one at all, "finally." The following week brought a shift so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, except it was everything. Catherine Ashford sat by the window of their small rented cottage on Barrow Lane, a needle between her fingers and a dress hem pulled across her lap. The light came in from the west in the afternoons, which meant she had to angle her work just so, tilting the fabric toward the glass, her faded auburn hair catching threads of grey in the sun. The thin brass wedding band on her left hand, worn smooth after all these years, caught the light each time she drew the needle through. Eleanor was reading. Of course she was reading. The small leather-bound poetry book open in her lap, her honey-blonde hair gathered in that loose, low knot with its usual escaped wisps, her grey-green eyes moving steadily across the page. She sat in the only good chair, the one whose cushion hadn't gone completely flat yet. Catherine didn't look up from her mending when she spoke, which was how Eleanor knew the words had been rehearsed. "Sir Geoffrey Hale has asked permission to call on you." That was all she said. She pulled the needle through the hem with the careful, practical precision of a woman who had been managing a household on almost nothing for years. She did not add commentary. She did not need to. Now, let's talk about Sir Geoffrey Hale, because here's the thing that makes this whole situation so much worse. Geoffrey isn't a bad man. He's not scheming. He's not conniving. He doesn't have some hidden agenda or a gambling debt or a secret cruelty he saves for people who can't fight back. He's just decent. Sandy blonde hair neatly parted, a dimple in his left cheek that appeared when he smiled, which was often, warm brown eyes that met yours without complication. He owned a comfortable estate called Thornfield, about 4 miles south. Good land, reliable income, no complicated title dragging behind him like a chain. He checked his polished brass pocket watch with a small, unconscious gesture, the way some men breathe. He was, in every measurable way, exactly the sort of match a widowed mother with no fortune and no connections would pray her daughter might attract. And he started calling, regularly. He brought flowers, lilies, then wild flowers, then once a small bunch of lavender tied with kitchen string, which showed he'd been paying attention because Eleanor had mentioned she liked the smell. He talked easily, about the weather, about his fields, about a horse he'd just bought that had a habit of standing in the middle of streams and refusing to move. Eleanor liked him well enough. He was pleasant, uncomplicated. He did not make her feel like the room was shrinking, like the air had gone thick, like she needed to guard every word because each one might cost her something she couldn't name. Her mother was visibly relieved. You could see it in the way Catherine's shoulders dropped half an inch whenever Geoffrey's boots sounded on the front path. The smoothing of fabric in her lap went slower. The worried line between her brows, the one that had been there since Eleanor's father died and left them with a good name and almost nothing else, softened just slightly. 3 visits in 1 week. Lilies the first time, lavender the third. The neighborhood noticed. Neighborhoods always do. And this particular piece of intelligence traveled, as such things do, through the precise and merciless network of drawing rooms and breakfast tables until it arrived at Greymere Hall and landed directly in front of Marcus Calloway's plate. His mother delivered it. Philippa, Dowager Duchess, sat in her customary chair at the breakfast table, perfectly upright, as though the furniture owed her something. Her silver-grey hair swept up in its precise chignon, the tortoiseshell lorgnette resting against her deep plum silk bodice on its thin gold chain. She lifted her teacup. She took 1 measured sip. She set it down. "Sir Geoffrey Hale has been calling at the Ashford cottage 3 times this week. He brought lilies." Marcus said nothing. He reached for the butter dish and applied it to his toast with the kind of focused, meticulous attention normally reserved for diplomatic correspondence. The gold signet ring on his right hand caught the morning light as his thumb pressed against the bread. He did not look up. He did not ask a follow-up question. He chewed with the deliberate patience of a man who was absolutely, categorically fine. Philippa watched him over her teacup. The pale blue eyes missed nothing. She said no more. She didn't need to. Here's what Marcus couldn't say at that breakfast table, what he couldn't say to anyone, what he could barely admit in the privacy of his own skull. He had obligations. A title. An estate with 47 rooms, most of them in need of repair. A political position his father had built and his peers expected him to maintain. Eleanor Ashford was the daughter of a dead country solicitor. No fortune, no connections, no standing whatsoever in the world that had produced Marcus Calloway and would judge every choice he made. To pursue her openly would be a statement, a declaration, and he was not ready to make it. But he could not stop thinking about her hands in the garden dirt, the smudge of soil on her wrist, her voice reading Cooper in the morning room with that unself-conscious clarity. The grey-green eyes looking up at him with absolutely no deference and telling him plainly that he was blocking the good light. Damn it. The Midsummer Assembly arrived on a warm June evening, a local dance, modest by London standards, held in the long room above the village inn. Candles in every window, the floorboards slightly uneven beneath the dancers' feet, the air already thick with warmth before the music started. Eleanor came with her mother and Geoffrey. Her sage-green muslin dress, the small leather-bound book of poetry left behind for once. Geoffrey offered his arm. She took it. Marcus arrived alone. He stood at the room's periphery, one hand behind his back, the other at his side, his jaw set, his signet ring turning slowly under his thumb. He did not dance. He did not cross the room. He stood at the exact edge where Eleanor had sat at the Hadley ball, watching from the margins while the world moved without her. Eleanor danced with Sir Geoffrey. She was pleasant. She laughed once, a real laugh, brief and warm, at something Geoffrey said while turning her through the figure. Across the room, Marcus watched. He could not look away. And for the first time the Duke was the one who was not trying, the one standing at the edge, the one who had no claim and no excuse and no reason to be there except that he could not make himself leave. It was destroying him. The roses were already open when Eleanor knelt beside them the next morning. 7 bushes along the cottage fence, every one of them pruned clean, every one of them blooming on schedule because she had never once forgotten to tend them. Her hands worked the soil without thinking, pulling a weed here, pressing the earth firm around a stem there. The small leather-bound book of poetry sat on the stone beside her knee, its edges soft and familiar, and she had not opened it once. She was replaying the assembly, not the dancing, not Sir Geoffrey's pleasant conversation, or the way his dimple appeared when he laughed at something she said about the punch being too sweet. Not the music, or the candles, or the thick, warm air of a room with too many people in it. She was replaying the edge of the room. Marcus Calloway had stood at the far wall with one hand behind his back and the other at his side, and he had not moved for the better part of an hour. She knew this because she had looked. 3 times. Maybe 4. Each time she told herself she was scanning the room, taking in the crowd, adjusting her bearings the way anyone does in a space full of people. Each time her gaze found the same spot. The dark navy tailcoat. The signet ring catching light from the nearest candelabra as his thumb turned it. Turned it. Turned it. She pressed her fingers into the soil and frowned. It was curiosity. That was all. A man that composed, that deliberately still in a room full of movement, naturally drew the eye. It was the same instinct that made you notice the one cloud holding its shape in a shifting sky. It did not mean anything. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and sat back on her heels. The sun was warm on the right side of her neck, on the tiny crescent birthmark just below her ear. The freckles across her nose had darkened over the summer. She pushed a loose wisp of honey-blonde hair behind her ear and told herself, firmly, that she was not thinking about the Duke of Greymere. She was wrong. 3 days later, an invitation arrived at the cottage, written in a secretary's careful hand on heavy cream paper, sealed with the Calloway crest. The Duke of Greymere respectfully requested the company of Miss Ashford and Mrs. Ashford at the estate, at their convenience, to advise on the restoration of the Greymere gardens. The existing grounds had been neglected. Miss Ashford's knowledge of the local soil and planting conditions, demonstrated during her previous visit, would be of considerable value. Catherine Ashford read the letter at the kitchen table, her grey-green eyes, the same shade as her daughter's, though more guarded, moving over the words twice. She folded it carefully, smoothed the crease with the pad of her thumb, and looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained entire paragraphs. Eleanor said nothing. Her mother said nothing. They went. At Greymere, the household had been expecting them. The housekeeper had set 3 places for tea in the garden without anyone asking her to do it. 3 places. Not 4, not 2. 3. because Mrs. Ashford would sit, and Eleanor would walk the grounds, and the Duke would walk with her, and everyone in the house already understood this, except possibly Eleanor herself. The gardener found something urgent to do on the opposite side of the estate. The cook sent out biscuits that were still warm. Every servant they passed offered a greeting that was just slightly too cheerful, the particular brightness of people watching something unfold exactly as they expected. Marcus met them at the south terrace. His dark chestnut hair was neatly swept back, his cravat precise, his posture as straight as a column. He greeted Mrs. Ashford with formal courtesy. He greeted Eleanor with the same formal courtesy, and then immediately looked at the garden wall behind her as though it required urgent attention. They walked. Eleanor pointed to the climbing roses on the south wall first. The supports were rusted and pulling away from the stone. 2 of the plants had reverted to rootstock, wild, thorny, flowerless, because no one had pruned them in years. She explained this with the same unhurried authority she used for everything, her voice clear and low, her grey-green eyes on the plants and not on the man beside her. The lavender along the east border had been planted in heavy clay soil. It would rot before autumn. The gravel path between the yew hedges was sinking because the drainage beneath it had never been properly laid. Marcus listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer opinions or attempt to demonstrate knowledge he did not possess. He simply walked beside her, with one hand clasped behind his back and his head slightly inclined toward her, and he listened. And this went on for the better part of an hour, nearly an hour. Alone together among the overgrown beds and the crumbling paths of an estate that had been slowly forgetting itself. The longest stretch of time they had ever shared. Toward the end, near the old sundial where the moss had swallowed the hour markers, Eleanor stopped and rested her hand on the stone. She was looking at a bed of foxgloves that had seeded themselves wild, spreading past any border, and she said something small, something offhand. Her father used to say the measure of a person was what they tended when no one was watching. A simple remark, the kind of thing you say while looking at an untended garden, meaning nothing more than the observation itself. It hit Marcus Calloway like a door slamming in a silent house. Because here is the pivot. Here is the fracture that runs through the whole foundation and shows you what the building is actually made of. Marcus had organized his entire life around being watched, every decision calibrated to the title, every room entered with the awareness of who was already standing in it, every word chosen for the ear that would receive it. He had perfected the architecture of being observed, and he had never once asked himself what he tended when no one was looking. And Eleanor Ashford lived as though no one was ever watching. That was not a strategy. That was not a performance. That was simply her, kneeling in dirt, speaking plainly, tending what needed tending because it needed tending. She was the only thing he wanted to watch. He walked her back to the cottage. The lane was narrow, the hedgerows high, the evening light turning the fields the color of old gold. Neither of them spoke. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm on the packed earth, and the silence between them was not awkward. It was full. At the cottage gate, Eleanor stopped. Her hand rested on the latch. The worn leather book was tucked under her other arm. She looked up at him. She had to look up. He was nearly a foot taller, and the last of the sun caught the grey-green of her eyes, the scatter of freckles, the wisp of honey-blonde hair that had come loose again. "You don't have to find reasons, Your Grace. If you want to walk in a garden, walk in a garden." 9 words, delivered without performance, without coyness, without any awareness of what they cost him. She went inside. The door closed. The latch clicked. Marcus Calloway stood at the gate for a long time. The signet ring turned on his right hand. The light faded. The first stars appeared above the ridge. He did not move. 2 days passed. 2 days of Marcus Calloway standing at windows he had no business standing at, turning that gold signet ring with his thumb like it owed him answers. 2 days of Eleanor Ashford walking the lane between her mother's cottage and the village with her small, leather-bound book of poetry tucked under her arm, not thinking about him, or telling herself she wasn't. Then the letter arrived. Not from Marcus, from his mother. Philippa Calloway's handwriting was precise, unhurried, each letter formed with the deliberate authority of a woman who had been writing invitations and dismissals for 40 years. The note was brief. She asked Eleanor to come to Greymere, not for tea, not for the garden. She needed someone to read to her in the afternoons. Her eyesight was failing, she explained. The books were too small. She needed a steady voice. Whether Philippa's eyesight was truly failing is a question worth sitting with. The woman could spot a misaligned teacup from across a dining room. She could read the social temperature of a ballroom in 3 seconds flat. Her pale blue eyes, sharp beneath those thin, arched brows, missed nothing. Not a loose thread, not a shifted glance. Not a son who had rearranged his walking schedule around a woman he claimed not to think about. But Eleanor didn't know any of that. Eleanor agreed because she liked reading. She liked Philippa. And she needed something to fill the hours that didn't involve standing at her own window, watching the lane toward Greymere, and wondering why she kept looking. She began coming 3 afternoons a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. The upstairs sitting room at Greymere faced south. Light came through 2 tall windows, in long, pale columns that moved across the carpet as the afternoon wore on, catching dust motes and the faint shimmer of Philippa's silver-grey hair, pinned with its tortoiseshell comb. Eleanor sat in a chair by the window. Philippa sat opposite, her needlework in her lap, her lorgnette resting against the plum silk of her dress. Between them, a small table held tea that cooled and was never drunk. The books were good. Shakespeare's sonnets first, then Burney, then Cooper again, because Philippa said she liked the way Eleanor read him, without performance, without the theatrical rise and fall that most young women learned in drawing rooms. Eleanor read the way she did everything, plainly, steadily. Her grey-green eyes moved across the page, and her voice filled the room the way afternoon light filled it. Warm, unhurried, belonging there. Marcus discovered the schedule within the week. Of course he did. A man who enters rooms as though he already knows where everyone is standing does not accidentally learn that a woman reads aloud in his house every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday from 2 o'clock until 3:30. He learned it the way he learned everything, by paying attention to things he told himself he wasn't paying attention to. By the 2nd week, he had developed a pattern. During reading hours, the Duke of Calloway found reasons to be in the corridor outside the upstairs sitting room. Urgent reasons. He needed a book from the shelf near the linen closet. He had a question for the housekeeper, whose office was, conveniently, 11 steps past the sitting room door. He paused. Just paused, hand behind his back, dark navy tailcoat perfectly pressed, to examine a painting on the corridor wall that had hung there for 30 years without once requiring examination. He stood in that hallway and listened to Eleanor read sonnets through a closed door, and the 3 small freckles near the corner of his left eye caught the light from the corridor window, and he did not move for a very long time. Philippa noticed. Philippa noticed everything. She said it to no one in particular, her needle drawing through linen with mechanical precision, her voice carrying the exact weight of a woman who has earned the right to say whatever she damn well pleases. She read to me for an hour. He listened from the hallway for 2. Then she pulled her thread tight, snipped it, and selected a new color as though she had commented on the weather. If you've been waiting for the moment the ground shifts beneath Eleanor's feet, it came on a Thursday morning before the reading hour when Sir Geoffrey Hale arrived at the cottage with flowers. He brought chrysanthemums, late-season ones, gold and rust-colored, wrapped in brown paper. He'd practiced his speech, You could tell because he delivered it with the careful cadence of a man who had rehearsed in front of a mirror and was now slightly ahead of his own breathing. Geoffrey stood in the small front parlor with his sandy blonde hair neatly parted, his dimple visible because he was smiling the way he always smiled, openly, warmly, without a single thing to hide. He checked his brass pocket watch once, a small, unconscious gesture, then tucked it away. He offered her everything practical: a good house, a good name, comfort, stability, a life where she would never worry about the cost of candles or whether the cottage roof would hold through another winter. Catherine Ashford watched from the doorway, her grey-green eyes, Eleanor's eyes, only more guarded, glistening. Her thin brass wedding band caught the light as she pressed her hands together. She saw a kind man offering her daughter a safe life. She saw the answer to every quiet prayer she'd whispered since her husband died. Eleanor asked for time. She did not say no. She did not say yes. She stood there with her honey-blonde hair loosely knotted at the nape of her neck, wisps framing her face, that small leather-bound book of poetry still in her hand because she'd been about to leave for Greymere when Geoffrey knocked. And she felt the weight of it. What a practical answer should be pressing against something else. Something she couldn't name. Something that lived in a corridor outside a sitting room, in a garden walk taken in silence, in the way a man had looked at her across an assembly hall as though she had interrupted a thought he would never finish. Geoffrey was the sensible choice. The Duke was an impossible one. She had no evidence. A hallway, a garden, a glance. These are not enough, she told herself. These are not enough. She went to Greymere that afternoon anyway. She read Cowper. Her voice did not waver. Afterward, Eleanor descended the stairs. Her hand trailed along the banister. Her cream leather half-boots were quiet on each step. Marcus was in the entrance hall below, standing still, one hand behind his back, the signet ring catching lamplight. They looked at each other across the full height of the staircase. Neither spoke. The distance between them was 12 steps. It might as well be the English Channel. The following morning, Marcus stood at the library window with one hand clasped behind his back, watching the garden path. The gravel was pale in the early light. The roses along the border had begun to open, the white ones Eleanor had noticed 3 weeks ago, the ones she had called persistent. He turned the gold signet ring on his right hand with his thumb, slow and deliberate, the way he always did when he was constructing an argument he needed to believe. He had made a decision, and the decision was wrong. He told himself it was honor. That word, honor, sat in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed on purpose, and he held it there because holding it hurt, and the hurt felt like proof that he was doing the right thing. Sir Geoffrey Hale was a good man, genuinely good, not good the way society uses the word, meaning acceptable, meaning harmless, meaning he won't embarrass you at dinner. Good in the way that matters. Kind without performance, steady without dullness, present without demand. Geoffrey checked his brass pocket watch not because he was impatient, but because he was the sort of man who believed other people's time deserved respect. Eleanor deserved that. She deserved stability. She deserved a life that did not require her to navigate the suffocating theater of being a duchess. The endless watching, the weight of rooms that went silent when she entered because everyone was measuring whether she belonged. He would stop finding reasons to be near her. He would stop walking the corridor outside the morning room when she read to his mother. He would stop arriving in the garden at the exact hour she walked the gravel path, pretending he needed air, pretending the roses required inspection, pretending anything at all. He would be what he had always been: controlled. The withdrawal began that afternoon. Marcus sent word through his steward, Mr. Finch, a man whose face revealed nothing and whose efficiency revealed everything, that His Grace would be occupied with estate accounts and correspondence for the foreseeable future and would not be available during Mrs. Calloway's afternoon visits. Finch delivered this message without inflection. Finch also placed the tea service for 2 in the morning room instead of 3.
and if his hands paused for half a second longer than necessary on the tray, no one remarked upon it. Eleanor noticed. Of course, she noticed. The library door stayed closed when she arrived. The corridor outside the morning room was empty. No boot heels pausing, no shadow retreating around the corner. The house at Greymere had 26 rooms, and Marcus Calloway managed to be absent from every single one she entered. She said nothing about it. She sat with Philippa, her small, leather-bound book of poetry tucked beside her on the settee, and read aloud from Evelina, with the same measured, quiet voice she always used, the same unhurried clarity that made every sentence feel like it was being handed to you personally. Philippa noticed, too. The Dowager Duchess sat in her chair with the posture of a woman to whom furniture owed a debt, her pale blue eyes tracking Eleanor's face with the precision of someone reading a document in a foreign language she happened to speak fluently. When Eleanor paused to turn a page, Philippa lifted her tortoiseshell lorgnette, examined the empty doorway behind Eleanor's shoulder, and set the lorgnette down on the side table with a firmness that could have cracked the mahogany. She said nothing, but the silence she said nothing in was so loud it practically had its own chair. Days passed. Eleanor finished Evelina. She came to the Greymere library to select the next volume, moving along the shelves with her fingertips trailing the spines the way she always did. Gentle, unhurried, as though the books might speak if she gave them time. The afternoon light came through the east-facing windows at a low angle, catching dust motes and turning the room golden. The fire in the grate was burning too hot, the way it always did in this room, and Eleanor pushed a wisp of honey-blonde hair behind her ear as she tilted her head to read a title. She pulled a volume from the second shelf. A collection of essays, nothing remarkable, the kind of book that fills space in a gentleman's library. But when she opened it, the margins were full. Marcus's handwriting, precise and small, almost architectural in its neatness, each letter formed with the deliberation of a man who treated even marginalia as a matter of duty. But the words themselves were not dutiful. They were personal, unguarded, written for no audience in a book no one else would open. One note beside a passage on public obligation read, "The performance never ends. One learns to mistake the costume for the skin."
Another, mere an essay on solitude. There is a difference between choosing to be alone and discovering that you have always been alone and merely failed to notice. And near the final page, in handwriting slightly less controlled, as though the pen had moved faster than intention, "I'm tired of being the only person in every room." Eleanor stood in the library with the book open in her hands, the grey-green of her eyes moving across his words, and the tiny, pale brown crescent birthmark below her right ear caught the light as she tilted her head. She understood. Suddenly. Completely. Not the politics of his withdrawal, not the logic of his supposed honor, but him. The weight he carried, the loneliness he had organized his entire life around, never admitting. If you've been waiting for the moment everything changes, this is it. She came back the next day, a Wednesday. She was not scheduled on Wednesdays. In the careful choreography of Greymere, where every visit had its designated hour and every presence its justification, arriving on the wrong day was an act of defiance so quiet it was almost invisible. Almost. Marcus was in the library, standing at the window again, one hand behind his back, the signet ring catching the firelight. He turned when she entered, and his face did what it always did, composed itself 1/2 second too late. Eleanor crossed the room. She set the annotated book on his desk. The sound it made against the wood was barely anything, a small thud, the weight of a life laid open. "You wrote that you were tired of being the only person in every room." Her voice was steady and plain and absolutely without ornament. You are not the only person in this room." Then she walked out of the Greymere library with the book still in her hands. She did not look back. Marcus stood in the middle of the room, his composure finally completely broken. The fire in the library was burning too hot. For the first time, he did not notice. That evening, Philippa Calloway finds her son in the library, still standing where Eleanor left him, the annotated book open on the desk. She sits down across from him and says nothing for a full minute. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantel marked the seconds with mechanical patience. Philippa's pale blue eyes moved from her son's face to the book on the desk, to the marginalia in a hand that was not his, to the way his fingers rested on the open page as though touching something he was afraid would disappear. The tortoiseshell lorgnette hung at her chest, untouched. She did not need it. She could see everything she needed from exactly where she sat, her back perfectly straight in the chair, her hands folded over the charcoal shawl draped across her shoulders. Marcus turned the gold signet ring on his right hand, once, twice, a third time. He did not look at his mother. He looked at the fire, which was still burning too hot, and then at the doorway Eleanor had walked through, and then at the book again. Philippa let the silence do its work. She was a woman who understood that some truths could only be reached by waiting, and she had been waiting for this particular truth for a very long time. Then she spoke. Not a lecture, not an instruction, a story. She told him about the day his father proposed. Not the official version, not the one repeated at dinner parties, the polished anecdote about the rose garden at Whitfield and the family ring and the perfectly composed letter to her father. The real version, the one no one else knew. His father had ridden 4 miles in the rain, not on horseback, on foot. He had walked from Greymere to her father's house in Hertfordshire, arrived at the kitchen door because the front door seemed too formal for what he needed to say, and stood there, dripping water on the flagstones, while the cook stared at him like he had lost his mind. His boots were ruined. His coat was soaked through. His cravat, and Philippa said this with a precision that suggested she could still see it, was hanging loose at his throat like a wet rag. He looked nothing like a duke's heir. He looked like a man who had run out of options for pretending. And he said one sentence. Just one. "I cannot be sensible about you, and I have decided to stop trying." Philippa paused. The small beauty mark on her left cheekbone caught the firelight. Her thin mouth held the ghost of something that might, in another woman, have been called tenderness. "Your father was a proud man," she said. "It was the only brave thing he ever did. And it was enough." She rose from the chair. She adjusted her shawl. She walked to the door without looking back, and the measured deliberation of her steps said everything her words had left out. She had carried this story for 40 years, waiting for the exact moment it would matter. This was the moment. Marcus stood alone in the library. The annotated book lay open. The fire burned. And something shifted in him. Not dramatic, not sudden, quieter than that. Like a door that had been locked for years, simply clicking open because someone had finally stopped pushing and turned the handle. He knew what pursuing Eleanor openly would cost. Let's be honest about it. Every parlour from Hertfordshire to London would light up with the scandal. A duke choosing a woman with no fortune, no title, no connections. The whispers would be exquisite. The matrons who had paraded their daughters through Greymere's drawing room would clutch their pearls so hard the strings would snap. Lady Whitmore, who had spent an entire season engineering proximity between Marcus and her niece, would probably require smelling salts. He did not care. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Calloway did not care what anyone was watching. He wrote one note before he left, not to Eleanor, to Geoffrey. The note was brief. It was honest in the way that only a man who has stopped protecting himself can be honest. An apology, genuine, not performative. an acknowledgement that Geoffrey Hale was a good man, a kind man, the sort of man who would have made Eleanor comfortable and safe and reasonably content. And then a single line that closed the door. He could not step aside. Sir Geoffrey read the note in his study. The polished brass pocket watch sat on the desk beside his elbow. He read it once, folded it neatly along the original creases, put it in his breast pocket. He sat for a moment with his friendly brown eyes fixed on the window, the dimple in his left cheek visible not from a smile, but from the way he pressed his lips together. "I knew at the assembly," he said, to no one, to the room. Geoffrey was not destroyed. He was disappointed the way decent men are disappointed, with grace and with the quiet understanding that wanting something does not entitle you to having it. He would be fine. He would marry someone else eventually, someone who would appreciate the steadiness of him, and he would be a good husband to her. But right now, in this study, he allowed himself 30 seconds of honest loss before putting the watch back in his pocket and standing up. Meanwhile, Marcus walked. 3 miles. The road from Greymere to Ashwick, a road he had travelled by carriage dozens of times without once registering its texture. Now he felt every inch of it. The gravel crunched beneath his polished black Hessian boots, which were accumulating a fine layer of pale dust. Hedgerows lined the road in uneven walls of hawthorn and dog-rose, the late afternoon light turning their leaves translucent gold at the edges. Fields stretched away on both sides, barley, he thought, almost ready for harvest, the heads heavy and bowing. The walk took 47 minutes. He did not rush. His dark navy tailcoat moved with each stride, and at some point his hand went to his cravat and loosened it without conscious thought. The starched white linen relaxed against his throat.
The buff breeches gathered dust at the cuffs. By the time the Ashford cottage came into view, the low stone wall, the climbing roses Eleanor had trained along the gateposts, he looked less like a duke and more like a man. In the Ashford cottage garden, among Eleanor's tidy roses, Marcus stands before Eleanor and her mother. He is not wearing his finest coat. He has walked the 3 miles from Greymere on foot. He has no speech prepared. Catherine's hand goes to the thin brass wedding band on her left hand, worn smooth with years. Eleanor holds her small leather-bound book of poetry, edges softened with use. Marcus looks at her, the honey-blonde wisps framing her face, the grey-green eyes, the tiny pale brown crescent birthmark below her right ear, and says 5 words. "I am tired of being sensible." The note arrived at Hale Park before 9 in the morning. A single sheet of paper, folded once, sealed with the Callaway crest pressed into dark blue wax. Sir Geoffrey Hale received it in his study, standing beside the window where early light caught the polished brass of the pocket watch he'd already checked 3 times since waking. He broke the seal without ceremony. The handwriting was careful, unhurried, the script of a man who had taken his time choosing each word and then crossed none of them out. It was 4 sentences long. The first acknowledged Geoffrey as a man of genuine worth. The second offered an apology, not for the outcome, but for the months of silence that had preceded it, the careful avoidance, the failure to speak plainly when plainness was owed. The third was the one that mattered. Marcus Callaway, Duke of Greymere, could not step aside. Would not. Not for propriety, not for the expectations of the county, not for the arithmetic of suitable matches that made Geoffrey Hale the sensible answer to a question Eleanor Ashford had never asked. The 4th sentence wished him well, and meant it. Geoffrey read the note twice. His thumb found the edge of the paper, smoothing it the way he smoothed every crease in every situation, gently, without force, as though the world could be kept orderly if you simply handled it with care. The dimple in his left cheek did not appear. His face was still, composed, and for a long moment he stood in that square of morning sunlight with the letter held loosely between 2 fingers. And he was simply a decent man, absorbing a loss he had seen coming since the night Eleanor Ashford looked past him at an assembly and did not realize she had done it.
He folded the note along its original crease. Precise. Even. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat, beside the brass watch, and the two objects settled against each other with a faint click. I knew at the assembly. He said it to no one. To the window, to the light, to the version of himself that had spent 3 months pretending otherwise. And then Geoffrey Hale, who was not destroyed, who was not bitter, who was simply a good man standing alone in a room where something had ended, checked his watch one final time, and went down to breakfast. That is what grace looks like when nobody is performing it for an audience. 3 miles of road connected Greymere Hall to the Ashford cottage. 3 miles of packed earth and loose gravel, hedgerows thick with late summer dog roses, a stone bridge over a stream so shallow it barely merited the crossing. Marcus Calloway walked every yard of it. No horse, no carriage, no valet trailing behind with a pressed coat and a contingency plan. He wore a plain dark coat, not his navy tailcoat, not the pale grey waistcoat with its subtle vertical stitching. Something simpler, something a man wears when he is not trying to be a duke. The gold signet ring on his right hand caught the light with every step. He turned it once, twice, then stopped turning it, and let his hands fall to his sides, and the ring was just a ring, and the road was just a road, and the man walking it was just a man who had finally run out of reasons to stay where he was. The cottage garden announced itself before the cottage did. Roses, tidy, deliberate, pruned with the kind of attention that comes from someone who believes disorder is a personal failing. Pink along the fence, white near the gate, a single deep red climber trained up the south wall with a patience that must have taken years. Eleanor's work. Every bloom an argument for competence over spectacle. She was standing among them when he came through the gate. The small leather-bound book of poetry was in her left hand, its edges soft with use, held against her hip the way another woman might hold a fan or a prayer book. Her honey-blonde hair was gathered in that loose, low knot at the nape of her neck, wisps escaping at her temples, catching the afternoon light in a way that turned them nearly gold. The sage-green muslin of her dress moved slightly in a breeze too faint to feel. The tiny pale-brown crescent birthmark below her right ear was visible, and real, and his. Not his, not yet, not unless he said something that earned it. Catherine Ashford stood 3 steps behind her daughter, just outside the cottage door. Her grey-green eyes, Eleanor's eyes, but older, more guarded, moved from Marcus to her daughter and back again. Her hand went to her left hand, to the thin brass wedding band worn smooth with years, and she turned it once with her thumb in a gesture so like Marcus's habit with his own ring that the symmetry should have been impossible. She said nothing. She did not need to. Catherine Ashford had buried a husband she loved and raised a daughter alone on a widow's income in a cottage with 14 rooms fewer than the house she'd grown up hoping for, and she knew exactly what it looked like when a man arrived somewhere with nothing left to hide behind. The garden was quiet. A blackbird sang from the hedge and then stopped, as though it too understood the weight of the moment. Marcus stood 6 feet from Eleanor, close enough to see the freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, far enough that crossing the distance would require a choice. He had no speech. He had rehearsed nothing on the walk, composed no elegant phrases, assembled no careful architecture of argument and persuasion. Every formal word he knew, and he knew hundreds, thousands, a lifetime's worth of language designed to keep the world at a controlled and comfortable distance, had abandoned him somewhere around the 2nd mile, falling away like stones from a collapsing wall, until what remained was so plain and so ordinary that it barely qualified as a declaration at all. Eleanor looked at him, not with surprise, not with the careful, performed confusion of a woman who does not understand why a duke is standing in her garden. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly and without pretense, and with those grey-green eyes that had never once asked him to be anything other than what he was. If you have been waiting for the moment everything changes, this is it. He opened his mouth. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a duke, It was the voice of a man who had walked 3 miles to say 5 words, and meant every one of them more than he had ever meant anything in his life. I am tired of being sensible. The garden held its breath, and we do not hear her answer. Not yet.